from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. Free at last he has ransomed me, his grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am.
Continuing in Acts chapter 23, we follow Paul in his journey that God has already set in motion that eventually placed Paul in Rome, giving witness to the powers of Rome and encouraging the brethren there. So far, in the first 11 verses, Paul has had his third conversation with the Jews in Jerusalem, and it has ended wildly out of control with a yelling and screaming match between the Pharisees and the Sadducees as they gathered as the Sanhedrin court. As that draws to a close, the Roman commander has to pull Paul out of there again to protect him in fear of Paul's life, concerned that he was about to be torn in pieces. And we already watched him have to rescue him off the street where they were trying to beat him to death. And so that's going to end that conversation. If there was any part of Paul that was second guessing, maybe he could have said things differently or done things differently. If there's any part of him that's lamenting that once again his beloved brethren, the Jews, have rejected Christ, God gives him a word of encouragement in verse 11 when he says to Paul in the night, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness in Rome also." Which is a way of affirming what Paul has done. What you've done here, I want you to do in Rome. That means by nature, that's approval rather than don't ever do that again, or let's do something different. He wants him to continue to do the same thing. Paul's desire is to reach the Jews, but he's just not been able to because they're not willing to listen. And we talked about the opening of the chapter, how Paul starts a conversation with the Sanhedrin, with those in verse 1 when he says, "Brethren, I've lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." He said, in other words, I've always done what I've thought was right. And then they're offended by that and things go out of control. But that's the statement that will continue to hold their feet to the fire of conviction. Because what he's going to say is, you've already heard my story, the previous chapter. I was also zealous like you. I was a persecutor of the way, but I meant Jesus. And so that's why I'm different. But in both cases, even when he's persecuting the church, he thought he was doing the right thing, which signals, just because you think you're doing the right thing doesn't mean that you are. You have to navigate from the will and the words of Jesus. If you're going off of what you think, then you're going to be somewhere entirely different. So motive, it's a good thing that you're trying to do the right thing, but that alone isn't sufficient. You can be absolutely sincere and still be going the wrong direction. You can be convinced that north is south and south is north, and you can be convinced and feel good about it while you're going the opposite direction. So it challenges them to consider not just what they feel or what they've always believed, but what is the truth here. And so as the majority of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, jump on Paul's side when he says, I'm on trial in verse 6 for the hope and the resurrection of the dead, that gets not only the Pharisees and the Sadducees at each other, but the Pharisees are like, well, we find no wrong in this man because, an angel or a spirit could have appeared to him. They're more interested in defending their own theological position than they are accepting then what that means, okay? So it's kind of like they had accused Jesus of breaking the Sabbath because he healed on the Sabbath. But the only way that logic works is you have to work on the Sabbath, and to work on the Sabbath, it has to be your profession. So to break the Sabbath by healing has to mean that's your profession, which means you're a healer, which means you're not the ordinary guy. If you're a healer, doesn't that mean something? Shouldn't we listen to him? Doesn't that verify what he's saying? But this wasn't a pursuit of truth, but rather a protection of their own turf, if you will. And so the same thing's happening here. They only get on Paul's side just because they want to argue with the Sadducees. If they meant what they said in verse 9, we find nothing wrong with this man, then why are they still trying to persecute him? They cannot say that and then accept what happens next in verse 12 and claim that they're doing what they think is right. So that word of Paul, I've always done what I've thought was right, or I have served God with a clear conscience, that's ringing in their ears. They're not doing that. They're not even trying to do that. Tragically, it's borne out in verse 12. When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. Okay, there's nothing righteous about this. This is a cold-blooded, premeditated murder by assassination. There's nothing godly about this in any way and in any stretch. Absolutely dark. Well, you say, well, that's these folks. Boy, they sure are upset. Okay, well, verse 3 or 13, there were more than 40 who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near the palace. And the chief priests and the elders tore their robes and threw dust in the air and said, how could you try to even do such a terrible thing? For this is in defiance of the will and the heart of God. This is evil. I wished. But they're complicit. There's no correction here. These are the chief priests. These are the intercessors. These are the bridge builders. These are those who will offer the sacrifice once a year for the sins of the people in the atonement for their sin. And they've just listened to 40 assassins say, we're going to murder a guy in cold blood because we all hate him. Works for me. Which is an absolute ringing condemnation of their souls because they cannot say what Paul said in verse 2. Paul didn't claim to be perfect. He didn't say I was always right. He didn't say I was sinless. What he said is, I've always done what I've thought was right. And sometimes that was right, and sometimes it was wrong. But he always thought he was doing right. That's a whole different thing than claiming to be perfect or flawless or sinless. At least he's trying to do the right thing. They're not. No stretch at all can make this anything other than absolute darkness of heart. Of course, they can't defy God. God has already said through the prophet that he's going to be bound and that he's going to Rome now in verse 11. And Paul continues to live on the promises and the faithfulness of God. If God says you're going to do this in Rome, he's going to Rome. Nobody can stop him. Nobody can kill him. Now, they can kill him in Rome, but they can't kill him in Jerusalem because he's got to go to Rome. That doesn't mean Paul knows when he's going. It doesn't mean he knows how he's going. It doesn't mean that he knows whether it's going to be a comfortable voyage or not. He is going to get an all-expense-paid cruise, but it's not quite ice sculptures and all-you-can-eat buffet. But it gives him the confidence in the middle of all this skullduggery, as we often say. They're not going to be successful because God said he's going to go to Rome. So here's how God does it. Verse 16, but the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. Now this is an interesting mystery. We don't know who Paul's sister is, and we don't know who his nephew is. And we don't know how he overheard it. But sometimes, I love these kinds of things, this verse, because sometimes we want to make God's work as always big and flashy and noticeable and fancy and wow and all that sort of thing. But often God is working in the quiet, everyday, mundane details of our life. Reminds me of Naaman the leper that was like, well, I'm not going to go dip in the Jordan 7 times. You remember his servant said, why not? I mean, if it had been some big thing, you're prepared to do it. So now when it's a simple thing, you won't do it? Said another way, most of us would easily, willfully, without a second thought, take a bullet to protect the lives of our wives, but we're not about to help with the dishes. So it's kind of interesting how it's in the details that we truly see what's genuine. So I don't know how, perhaps the young man was crossing the street and heard two soldiers, or these two Jews rather, talk. I don't know if he happened to walk by an open window and heard them talking. I don't know if they happened to go around the corner and that's what they were saying. The point is, it's going to be a seemingly random, coincidental, small detail that allows this young man to hear in a way that the Jews didn't know who he was, didn't know he was connected to Paul, and so on. So God uses these small things, and I just want to encourage you. Sometimes if we have a flat tire, the light turns red, whatever it is, our day's not going right, we get all frustrated. God can handle flat tires. If he wants it to go flat, it's probably not going to stay up. And if he doesn't want to go flat, You can drive over a mile of nails. That God is in control of things because whatever happens changes the timing of where we are, when we are, who we meet, who we don't meet. All of that shifts all the time. God knows, we don't. So he comes and he tells Paul, verse 17, Paul called one of the centurions to him and he said, lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him. That tells you a lot about the atmosphere that Paul's in. He's not in chains because they pulled the chains off of him quick when they realized he's a Roman. And Paul's attitude is such as, would you do this to a Roman? And obviously Paul hasn't been haughty or been arrogant or been implacable or just incredibly annoying, because he has close contact and easy conversation with a centurion. And when Paul says something, they take it seriously. It's not a demand. It's just, hey, here's some, you need to pass this on. So he does. So verse 18, the centurion took Paul's nephew and he led him to the commander and he said, Paul the prisoner called me to him and he asked me to lead this young man to you since he has something to tell you. So the centurion's got a lot of respect and confidence in Paul because he doesn't even know what the message is. What if this boy's saying something crazy? What if this boy's going to say something silly? And now the centurion looks foolish in front of the commander's sight. The centurion trusts and believes in Paul enough to do what he's asked. The commander also has that same kind of attitude toward Paul. Of course, they're also there's some leverage here because they did put Paul in chains and nearly scourged him until Paul revealed he was a Roman. So he's got some leverage here still because they still messed up. They didn't scourge him. That would have been disastrous. But they still put him in chains. So there's some room here. So the commander took him by the hand and stepping away began to inquire of him privately. So this pulls him off into another room or a hallway and then asks him quietly, what do you have to report to me? The fact that Paul didn't tell the centurion, that the centurion doesn't know, signals to the commander this must be a private matter. Rather than some, hey, I'm out of Dr. Pepper, or could I get another loaf of bread, which he wouldn't have been asking the commander anyway. So obviously it's sensitive information. So he asks the young man what it was. Verse 20, and so the young man says, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So once again, it's a lie. They're not going to. They're not trying to find truth. They're not trying to understand. They're just trying to kill him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him, and now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you. So I mean, they're motivated. They're all in. They're committed. They're serious. So the commander let the young man go and instructed him, tell no one that you've notified me of these things. Let's go ahead and let them plan on this. That way we can do something different. If we tell them we know, then they'll start over with another plan and we're not going to hear the details. So what the centurion decides to do is not set up a decoy and get the assassins to come out of ambush and round them all up and prosecute them for attempted murder, hold them accountable for such actions. No, he's not going to do that. What at least he'll do, though, he is going to try to protect Paul. So, verse 23, he called to him 2 of the centurions, and he said, get 200 soldiers ready, because that would have been 100 apiece. That's what centurions would have been in charge of. Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night. So we're talking about by 9 o'clock at night, in the dark. Get them ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea. That's roughly about 70 miles away. With 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. This commander's an interesting fellow. It seems to me like he just doesn't take the time to figure out what he's dealing with. Or maybe he's just so still rattled by the big mistake that he almost made in scourging a Roman citizen. Maybe he's just going way out of his way now to show Paul and everybody else, I'm really doing right by this Roman citizen. It sure seems like a lot. You got 40 Jews, 40 hungry and thirsty Jews who were not professional assassins or not zealots. They just want to kill him by a fairly crude method. So they're going to be 200 soldiers under the command of 2 centurions. That's That's a lot of guys that could surround Paul. We're going to add to 200 soldiers, we're going to add 70 horsemen, a cavalry. In those days, the cavalry was the biggest, most impressive, the fiercest part of any army because of both the mobility, the strength, and the speed of the cavalrymen and their horses. So, I mean, this is first class. This is rolling the tanks, the helicopters, the jets, the Marines. I mean, this is rolling it. And 200 spearmen. It's kind of an interesting word, spearmen. It literally means those who have something in their hand. And so there is some discussion. Is it the spearmen? Is it the slingers with those atlats, they call them, the little short spears that are slung off of the shoulder, kind of as it's a mid-distance weapon. Maybe it could be bowmen, those are archers. But it's literally the slingers or the throwers. So what exactly is the throwing? We don't know. It's an interestingly unique word used by Luke. But you're talking about 200 legionnaires, which led by 2 centurions is mean business. And then you got to add 200 spearmen, so that's 400, plus 70 horse, nearly 500 men. It had to have been interesting to be Paul. I mean, wow. So he's seen the riot out of the temple, and he's watched the Sanhedrin and all of their power and authority and might throw a fit. And then he's cruising along to Caesarea on horseback. Some argue the word literally is beast. Some argue that donkeys might have been more accurate for the period. But Paul's cruising around on horseback, surrounded by 470 of Rome's finest. That's got to be kind of like, well, I guess I've made the big time. I must be a whole lot bigger threat than I would have ever thought. All of this because he wants to tell people that Jesus loves them so much he died for them to save them. That's what all this is about. Had to have been an interesting experience for Paul to see all of this swirling around him. Verse 24 continues, they were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. So this commander's gone out of his way to make sure Paul is kept safe. There's also a statement here, certainly to the opposition, but to Paul, which maybe that's really what he's trying to do, is really, really, really make sure Paul knows, man, I'm sorry, I'm on your side, I got your back, I'm treating you right. Because once he goes out of his jurisdiction, does Paul rat him out? Does Paul talk about what the commander had done? Maybe that's part of this overkill. He's going to go to Felix the governor in Caesarea. Felix is not a nice guy. He and his brother reign together, having been appointed by Caesar. Felix and his brother both were the brothers over a larger portion, and Felix is given this section. They were both born slaves and then adopted by a noblewoman, and both purchased their citizenship, like the commander did, to become Romans. The historians talk about Felix to say that he was a man who exercised the authority or the power of a king with the spirit of a slave. He was known for his temper, his anger, his lusts, his mistresses, all that stuff. There's no real redeeming comments about Felix from the historical record. So that's where Paul gets to go. He gets to go from the Sanhedrin, these really hypocritical religious folks, to a pagan, an accomplished pagan, to say the least. So the Roman commander writes a letter, and he has this form, and then this follows. Luke records the ancient form of letter writing. You get to see both the content and kind of the way it was done. Verse 26, he says, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. And so the commander uses his Roman name. And then I think it's kind of interesting, verse 27. When this man was arrested by the Jews and about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops, and I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Well, I mean, it's true, but it's not true, right? Telling the truth with the intent to deceive is still a lie. Yes, he did rescue him, true, because he saw the ruckus. And yes, he did learn that he was a Roman, but only after he had him stretched out, put in chains, stretched out in preparation to be scourged. Well, details. In wanting to learn or ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. Like, well, what's all this about? I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusations deserving death or imprisonment. Like anything, like chains. I don't, there's no reason this man's guilty, but these guys are really stirred up and they're really trying to kill him, but I sure don't know why. Not even guilty of any cause for imprisonment, which tells us his stay in the barracks has been one that's been very courteous, right? He's not been in a jail cell. He's not been chained to the wall, but we could call it house arrest. You're fine. You're a guest here. Just don't leave. And that, one of the interesting things is from here on out, that will be Paul's experience. It'll be more of the house arrest approach, the beatings, the near lynchings, the scourgings and all that. That's all going to go away because this Roman citizenship card has changed the tone. Verse 30, when I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. Hands it off, kind of the appellate case. Here's an appeal. Let me send this along. I can't get to the bottom of this, so I know you can handle it. So verse 31, so the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, which is almost halfway. It's about 26 miles from Jerusalem. They'll get there through the night, verse 32, but the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, then they return to the barracks. It doesn't make all the foot soldiers go the whole 70 miles to Caesarea. It is a rough march all through the night to get there the next day, and then Paul will continue on his horse along with the cavalry. So still plenty of protection. So it sure sounds like either Claudius is not so much worried about, it's going to be, or the commander, Claudius, it's going to be risky getting him there, but we just got to get him out of town, which they are. And, of course, it surely would make a positive impression on Paul. So, verse 33, and when these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. Here's the guy. When he read it, he asked from what province he was from. This would be a kind of a legal question that would have to do with jurisdiction. Because it's still got to be a part of Felix. It's like, why? So this happened in Jerusalem. Why are you in Caesarea? Why are you here? So when he read it, he asked from what province he was. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also. This puts it in, that's the larger province. That puts it in Felix' jurisdiction, which also makes sense why Claudius would have sent him that direction. He's heard Paul talk about way back in chapter 22 who he is and where he's from, and so he would know to send him to Felix. So I'll give you a hearing when your accusers arrive also, because they didn't know Paul was leaving, so they're behind. So it's going to be a few days. Paul's got to be tired. He's already had all the energy and the tension, the drama, the excitement about this assassination attempt, and then they travel all the way through the night, and then they get to Caesarea the next day. So they go through the night and the next day, even riding horseback. That's a long ride, and that's exhausting. That's nearly 24 hours of travel. He's got to be tired. So he says, verse 35, I'll give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium, which is now, of course, where Felix resides. This would have been Herod the Great's palace, who's since come and gone. So again, Paul is not put in prison. He's not put in jail. He's not put in chains, because he's a Roman. That was clearly signaled back in the letter in verse 27. And so again, we would call this house arrest. Paul is considered and treated like a guest, but one that cannot leave. And so enjoy all of that. As far as resting, he's got to be tired. And so what happens in the very next chapter, in chapter 24, 5 days later, the high priest Ananias comes down with some elders and with an attorney, because this is a legal and official matter. And they're going to have this hearing in front of Felix. So what also happens again, you could say, man, what a frustration, but yet Paul again is going to have another audience with Jewish leadership. They're going to hear it again, another opportunity Maybe their heart will turn, but it's an opportunity for Felix as well to hear the gospel. It's just incredible. In normal circumstances, how would any missionary, how would any evangelist ever be given an opportunity to address the Sanhedrin? But because of all of the hardship, Paul was able to. How would you ever have access to have a conversation, both public and private, with the Roman commander and his troops? But Paul does. How would you ever get in front of the governor? How would you ever get in front of Felix and have an audience with him and have an opportunity to share who Jesus is? But Paul will. So you can get wrapped up in either this is horrible and I'm being treated unfairly and this is not just, and God, why are you letting me go through all this? Where are you? Why don't you rescue me? Or you can see this as what an opportunity, what a rarefied access that I've been given to these different people in their lives that I would never be able to talk to them in any other way. And it's a difference in living life in fear or living life in faith. God said, you're going to Rome. So Paul's like, I'm going to Rome. That means he can't be killed in Caesarea. That means he can't be held in Caesarea forever. He's going to Rome because that's what God said. That'll help him in the trial, if you will, or at least the conversations with Felix. It'll help him before Festus, and it'll help him in a stormy sea on a sinking ship. He's not going to die in the Mediterranean in a storm because he's going to Rome. God is in control, and since Paul surrenders that outcome, he lives in faith, not in fear.
The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever he is glorified. Forever he is lifted high. Forever he is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb